In this video, I'm going to show you how to make a sourdough focaccia that's super soft and fluffy on the inside, but crispy and crunchy on the outside. It's absolutely delicious. Here's how you make it. So this is going to be a very simple way to make focaccia. You're basically mixing everything together at the beginning with no autolyse. First, you're going to add 350 grams of water to your mixing bowl. Then add to that 10 grams of salt. Then just mix that all together to dissolve the salt into the water a little bit. That's going to help everything just incorporate together. Since we're not going to be doing a lot of kneading with this recipe, you want the salt to be well incorporated into the water. Then get your spoon wet again and add your starter. It's going to be about 50 grams of sourdough starter for this recipe. If it's really warm where you are, you might want to add a little bit less sourdough starter, probably about 30 grams, but 50 grams is what I'm using. I like to mix my sourdough focaccia in the evening and let it bulk ferment all night long, so about 8 to 10 hours. Since it does have such a long time to rise, that is why I use half the amount of starter as my regular sourdough bread recipe. It just has more time to ferment, so you need less starter. Then to that liquid mixture, add 475 grams of bread flour. The total amount of flour in this recipe will be 500 grams when you include the 25 grams in the starter. Give everything a good mix with a spoon or with a bowl scraper of some kind, and just basically mix it until the flour starts to absorb the water. You don't want any dry bits of flour left when you're done mixing. And this is more of a high hydration sourdough bread, so you shouldn't have many dry spots anyway. Which brings me to a mistake I made. I left out 25 grams of the water from the recipe for some reason. No idea why, so I just added that back in and stirred the water to incorporate. So if you ever leave out part of the water in your recipe, it is possible to mix it back in later as long as you haven't completely kneaded your dough or something. So once your dough has all the water that it needs, it'll be at 75% hydration if you follow my recipe, and it should look something like this. Now you just need to scrape down the sides of your bowl with a bowl scraper, clean it up a little bit, and then your dough will be ready for the next step, which is not going to be olive oil. We are going to add a little bit of olive oil to the recipe, but first we're going to let the dough rest. So cover it up and let it rest for a half hour, and then we'll get to the oil. Now, I don't like any extra steps, so if you want to, just go ahead and put the oil in right from the beginning with all the other ingredients. But I like to wait 30 minutes because the dough really builds a lot of gluten like this, and then when you add the oil in after that, I just feel like it gives me a better result. So I'm adding in 25 grams of olive oil right on top of the dough. Go ahead and do that, and then just squeeze in the oil with your fingers. You can use a spoon to stir it around if you want to, but I like to get in there with my hands and just squeeze the oil all throughout the dough. This olive oil is going to make the focaccia rich and really just luscious when you eat it, but it's also going to make it softer. That's what oil does in dough. It does soften the bread a little bit. So olive oil, very important for focaccia. Once you've squeezed the oil through the dough with your hands, go ahead and do a little bit of stretching and folding of the dough just to build structure and make a smooth ball of dough. I promise this is the only stretching and folding required for this recipe. You wouldn't even have to do it if you didn't want to, but I find that it just makes the ball of dough really smooth and easy to work with. So just take an edge of the dough, pull it into the center, then go around the bowl, grab another edge, pull it up into the center, and eventually you have a nice, smooth ball of dough that looks something like this. There you go. Not a completely no-knead recipe, but with almost no work at all, you get a nice, smooth ball of dough. So go ahead and pop that back into the bowl, and then flip it over so it's smooth side up and seam side down. And then this is the super easy part. You just cover it up and let the dough rest for about 8 to 10 hours or overnight, and just let it ferment. All right, really quickly, if you like this recipe so far, or if you've made any of my other sourdough recipes in the past, you know that I like to keep my sourdough process pretty straightforward. So if that's your kind of thing, I want you to check out my new ebook called Nonsense Sourdough. It's 26 of my all-time favorite sourdough bread recipes without any complicated steps, no fancy terminology. There's no autolyse, no bossonage, none of that stuff in this book. So if you're tired of complicated sourdough recipes, I really think that this ebook, No Nonsense Sourdough, is for you. So check it out after this video. There's gonna be a link in the description and right here, somewhere right here. Let's get back to the focaccia. Okay, 8 hours later, my focaccia has been bulk fermenting overnight, and it has pretty much doubled in size in this bowl. And you can see a lot of air bubbles have already formed during the bulk fermentation. It's really puffy and light to the touch. And here's what I love about a long fermentation. When you pull on the edge of the dough, you can really see that gluten network that is formed on the side. But pretty much all you need to worry about is that your dough has doubled in size and it's nice and puffy. This is my favorite non-stick pan for focaccia. I will have a link in the description for this one. It's a 9 by 13 inch pan and it's actually non-stick, which is awesome. I'm gonna add about 25 grams of olive oil to the pan. One of the reasons focaccia is so delicious is that olive oil is in 3 different parts of the recipe. There's olive oil in the dough to make it soft. There's some olive oil in the pan, which is gonna fry the bread and give it a nice crispy focaccia bottom. And then later there's gonna be olive oil on top of the dough before we bake it. So just spread the olive oil, about 25 grams, all throughout your nonstick pan. And then just carefully transfer the dough, the smooth side up and the seam side down on top of the olive oil in the pan. And you're just gonna stretch the dough gently right now. You're not gonna dimple it or anything. Just gonna try to pull on the corners of the dough to stretch it out a little bit to try to reach as far as you can towards the edges of the pan. If you try to pull it all the way to the edge, it's gonna spring back. That's okay, just kind of pull it gently as far as it'll go and stop. Now cover up your pan with plastic wrap or a kitchen towel, something that will keep the dough clean and free of drafts while it's sitting on your counter to proof throughout the day. Then if you're making this in the morning like me, you can pretty much just let it proof throughout the whole workday, about 6 to 12 hours until right before dinner. Just let it proof on your counter at room temperature until it's super bubbly. It should look something like this. It's doubled in size, it's filled the pan, and I'm not ready to bake it quite yet, so I'm gonna move it to the fridge right now. For a sourdough focaccia, you can keep it in the fridge to kind of halt the fermentation process. Then when you're ready to bake, preheat your oven to 450 degrees Fahrenheit for about a half hour. Then while the oven's preheating, add in a cake pan or some kind of tray. That's how you're gonna add steam to the oven later while the bread is baking. And then here's my focaccia after about 10 hours of proofing at room temperature and then another hour in the fridge. It is super bubbly, it is light and puffy to the touch. And one of the reasons I love focaccia, and it's great for beginners, is because you can really overproof this bread and it'll turn out fine, which I would say if I was trying to bake a loaf of bread, this would definitely be overproofed. But for focaccia, it's perfect. Now's the time to top your focaccia with some amazing toppings. So add another 25 or so grams of olive oil. I don't usually measure, I just pour it directly on. And then with the flat part of your fingertips, you're gonna get those nice and oily and then dimple your focaccia. This is one of the most fun parts of making focaccia. Just take the flat part of your fingertip and press down till you're pressing against the bottom of the pan. You can add a few more dimples here and there. And there's just unlimited toppings you can put on top of your focaccia, but I always put olive oil, follow that by sea salt. So just add a little bit of sea salt, a few sprinkles should be good, and then add whatever else you want to put on top of your focaccia. I'm using Kalamata olives today, about 100 or so grams of olives. You can use rosemary, that's one of my favorite toppings as well. And if you follow the link in the description to the recipe, I'm going to give you a bunch of different ideas for focaccia toppings just so you can, keep it light and breezy. Use whatever you want. With these olives, I like to press them down into the dough just a little bit so they stay, and then this is ready to bake. So with your oven preheated to 450 degrees Fahrenheit, with some hot water ready to go for steam, you're going to put the focaccia onto the center rack of your oven. You can see here I've got a pizza steel that just lives there in my oven. That's an optional step, you don't need that. Put the focaccia in, and then carefully, as careful as you can, pour some hot water into that preheated tray. That's just going to create some steam in the oven and give the focaccia a delicious crust. Then once your water is in that tray making steam, bake this for 30 to 35 minutes total, and then remove the steam tray about halfway through the baking time. Then a half hour later, your focaccia should be done and look something like this. And you'll even hear it sizzling from all of that olive oil. And here is the reason that I love the nonstick pan that I use for focaccia. This bread just comes out with no sticking whatsoever. It comes out perfectly. And if you've ever had focaccia stick to the pan before, you just know you want to avoid that at all costs. So check out that nonstick pan. Here the focaccia is ready to go, but I'm going to let it cool for 1 hour because it's better if you let it cool. So 1 hour later, this focaccia is ready to slice. One of the other I keep saying there's so many great things I love about focaccia, but you can just eat it plain. You don't need to spread anything on focaccia because it already has everything it needs. It's got toppings, it's got olive oil on the inside, and just look at that crumb. It's so moist and tender, and I just love focaccia. And sourdough focaccia is focaccia at its best, if you ask me. And check out how easy it tears, how easy it cuts, and obviously, by the way I'm eating it, it's just delicious, and you need to make it for yourself. Here's one of the cool things about focaccia I also like is the crispy focaccia bottoms. You can see it's just fried in that olive oil, which is another reason it's so delicious. If you've never made focaccia before, you need to try this recipe, my sourdough focaccia. It's absolutely amazing. This recipe, along with 25 other recipes, is in my No Nonsense Sourdough ebook, so check that out as well. This has been Grant with Grant Bakes. I will see you in the next video.